Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name's Richard. In today's video, we're going to be talking about exposure. I know that is something that as a new photographer, many people struggle with. Understanding things like ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. What do those terms mean? And so we're going to be talking about how you can nail your next photo using that information that you gain and how to better understand these terms. So let's get into it. So I know it can be a little hard to understand what each of these topics mean or what these terms mean specifically. And so I'm going to break down each of them individually and help you understand them. And to help me do that, I'm going to be using a picture that I've already taken, and we're going to be using Lightroom, where we can see how the different things can affect the image. So let's jump into Lightroom and we'll get started. So now that we're here in Lightroom, we're going to be talking about the exposure triangle. And these are the three things that make up the exposure of an image, or how clear, how bright, or how dark the image is. And so we're going to focus on one of these at a time and then talk about how they work together to create a good image. So first off, we'll talk about aperture. And aperture is an important one because it's one of the biggest things that can affect how your image looks. So I'm going to show you an example of a picture here of different apertures. Now, depending on the lens that you're using, the aperture will change on what apertures you can achieve. So for this specific lens, it shows the example of f1.4 all the way to f8, and these are all called f-stops. These are all different images that come out of these different f-stops. So for example, f1.4 has a very wide ring. You can see that the aperture is wide and open. Now, how is that going to affect the image? I'm going to show you an example of an image that I took, and this one had a fairly wide aperture, closer to that 1.4 range. Now, what that does is it causes the image to lose focus in the background. It blurs that background more than the foreground. So the subject right here, this pelican, is in focus, but you can see that the island in the distance is out of focus, and you can see that even the buoy as you go out is losing focus. And that's because the aperture controls how much light it's letting into the camera or onto the sensor. And so depending on how wide or open that aperture is what's going to change that. So you can see that if we went down all the way to f8, that ring is closed quite tightly, and you can get even tighter than f8 in some lenses. But what this does is it allows less light to come through, but it's more focused light, meaning that the focus of your image is going to be sharper throughout the whole image, or what they call it is a depth of field. You can see that as the distance goes out in this photo, that depth of field changes. And so if we had that f8 set up, it would be creating that wide depth of field, meaning that more of the image would be in focus. And so that comes into play and is really important because it allows us to have different focuses on our image. If I wanted the whole image to be in focus, like for example a landscape photo, then I'd want that small aperture. The larger the number, the smaller the actual aperture gets, the smaller that hole gets for the light to become focused. And so that's something that's important to remember. Now the next thing would have to be shutter speed. Shutter speed affects how fast that sensor opens and closes to collect light for the image to be developed. Now if I had a very fast shutter speed, that means there's not a whole lot of time for the light to come in, which means that I'd have an underexposed image. And if the faster the shutter speed or the slower the shutter speed is, that means that you're going to have more light coming in, which could oversaturate the image. And so that is equally as important as aperture, because you need to know how long the image needs to be open. Now there's a couple factors that play into that, but for now we're going to focus on just the shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is important for people who are taking different types of photo. Like, for example, a landscape photographer or an astrophotographer who takes pictures of the stars, they're going to need very different photos than someone who's taking car photography or athlete photography. People who are running, people who are in motion, cars that are in motion need a fast shutter speed so you can catch them in a still image. Now, some artists, photographers like to have that motion blur from the movement of an object, but if you're wanting a still image, then you want that fast shutter speed. Now, when you have a slow shutter speed, what that means is that it's open for longer periods of time. For example, it's in seconds. So when you see on a camera 1/32 or 1/32, that's 1/32 of a second, meaning that it's only open for milliseconds. It's not open for a long period of time. And so the smaller you go in fractions, so like 1/64 or 1/28, those are going to be very fast photos, meaning not a lot of light is going to come into the image. But something at 1 second or manual where you can hold the button as long as you want allows for a lot of light to come into the image. Now, this is really important when you're taking like star photography or you're doing night photography. In the low light situations, you want that shutter speed to be open for a longer period. But what that does is that also affects the focus of the image, or how blurry or sharp the image is. If you're taking a photo for a long time, that sensor's open, any bump or movement in the camera is going to create that motion blur. So that's why a lot of people you'll see when they're doing low light photography, they're on a tripod and they're very still. They try not to move because any bump causes that image to be blurry. And so that's something very important to remember, but can be very important. And so that's why in situations where you have a lot of light, it's nice to have a faster shutter speed, or like 1/64th, 1/28th, because that allows you to take a faster image. Now, that's important to remember because when we go back to this exposure triangle, when you go for a faster shutter speed, that means that you need to open the aperture up wider, or to have f1.4, a smaller number, meaning that it's larger in size, so that you can have more light coming in to be captured with less time. Now, ISO is really important because it deals with how sensitive the camera's sensor is to light. If we go back to that image of the pelican, you can see that if we had a high ISO, what it would do is it would introduce noise, or grain, as many people know it. The image would look really unclear, really staticky and pixelated, and just not good. So generally photographers try to keep ISO down at a low level so that they can have a very crisp and clear image. Now, in some situations, like in low light photography, you can't get enough light into an image without bumping up your ISO. So there are situations where you do have to, and sometimes even sacrifice a little bit of that noise in order to get the image. But in most situations, you're able to keep that ISO at a low number so that you can get a crisp image. Now, to keep in mind for ISO, the higher the number you go, the more grain or noise is going to be introduced into your image. And so in those situations where you have to have that low light, you have to have your aperture open really wide, your shutter speed slow, so that you're capturing a lot of light. Sometimes that's not enough, and sometimes you need to open up and make that sensor more sensitive to light so that it can capture more light. Especially in star photography or astrophotography, you need that sensitive shutter speed and sensitive aperture and ISO so that it's capturing the most light possible, so you can capture the Milky Way, the stars, the constellation, a planet, things like that can be very important for ISO. So that's why it's a triangle, because it shows how each of these things affects it. When your aperture is open wide, you get a very nice shallow depth of field, putting the focus on your subject. But in doing so, you have to have a slower shutter speed, meaning that you need more stability with a tripod or something. That also means that your ISO may be affected. Now, cameras have different settings that they can use to help make your life easier, especially as you're starting out, because I know that it can be difficult to focus on all the different things. And so in manual mode, you can control all of these. But there's something on a camera called aperture priority mode, or AP, or It's different on each camera, but aperture priority lets you prioritize the aperture that you want, lets you pick between these different settings that your lens has so that you can focus on just that, and the camera will take care of these other ones so that you can get the best image without having to do as much work. There's also shutter speed priority that will allow you to take crisper photos in situations where there's a lot of movement. So if you're someone at a track meet trying to take a photo of your kids, or a professional photography situation in football or in a race, something like that, you want to just focus on your shutter speed. You want to make sure that you're getting a crisp image, but you don't want to worry about the rest and ruining your image. In that case, having it on that priority where you can just control the shutter speed can be nice. So as you're learning your camera, just remember that these are the different things that are affected and the different things that make up the exposure of the image, or how bright or dark the image is. And so you can see that when you change those things, it basically does this to a photo, whether it makes it so you can't use the photo because it's too light or too dark. Now, a good rule of thumb is if you underexpose the image, it's always easier to fix that in post versus overexposing. It's really hard to get information back from overexposing an image, but it's easier to get it if it's underexposed or darker. So I hope that this can help you to kind of visualize a little bit more what the exposure triangle is and what makes this up, and how you can use it to your benefit, especially as you're starting out in photography. So now we'll go back and I'll continue to talk to you. So I hope that you found this video helpful and that it will allow you to take better photos in the future. Just remember that it is a learning process, and you'll find what works best for you, and you'll get comfortable using those settings. Now with cameras, you can always choose different modes. For example, aperture priority mode, where you only have to think about the aperture that you want, that depth of field, and the camera will take care of the rest. Equally for shutter speed, if you're someone who wants to get into wildlife photography or sports photography, where you need to keep your shutter speed at a certain rate, they do have modes for that, where you're able to just control your shutter speed and let the camera deal with the rest. Now, as you're learning, don't be afraid to mess with the settings, but also don't be afraid to just leave it in auto for a while while you're learning to try and see what lighting can do to your images, but don't be afraid to mess with it as well. It is a learning process, and you will get better as you continue to experiment and take photos. So I encourage you to continue to do so. And I will be releasing other videos on my editing process and how I edit photos, and how you can have an easier time with your editing process, as well as other things pertaining to video. So continue to follow the channel and subscribe, and you'll be able to see more content that I put out that will allow you to improve as a photographer. So I hope that you have a great week, and we'll see you next time.